In general, regulatory uncertainty is not welcomed, and that's especially important in the current context when many of our members across the supply chain are experiencing real pressures in terms of inflationary costs, cost pressures for things like labour, fuel, electricity, and at the same time things like supply chain disruptions related to the war in Ukraine, which is obviously leading to a lot of market volatility. We do welcome the opportunity to review existing EU legislation, notwithstanding our concerns. The arbitrary timescales and sunsetting clauses within this legislation, that would obviously create, from our point of view, an unnecessary and unacceptable risk of there being essentially a hole in legislation if it was not replaced, revoked, reformed with something similar. So that obviously would then have an impact upon the underpinning of animal health and welfare regulations. If there was a failure due to the sort of sunsetting clauses and the timescales set out within the proposed legislation, if there was a failure to ensure minimum standards for food and feed safety, that would have major business and trade implications, particularly obviously for our feed-producing members. And in a situation like that, what would probably happen is that the supply chain itself, through our various assurance schemes, would have to implement our own standards to essentially reciprocate EU legislation to ensure continuity of trade, especially where we have members who are exporting to the single market. Essentially, this bill runs the risks of exacerbating divergences because of the timescales that are put in place and because of the reality of how do you balance the executive freedoms of this place, of the United Kingdom government, maintain a level playing field when there are vastly differing political priorities from the point of view of, I assume, a view of retaining as much EU law as possible from a Scottish perspective and possibly going down a differentiated route in the rest of the UK. So that is a concern and maybe one to take back in terms of the timescales, which might make that divergence risk higher. Having said all of that, I would also make the point that from our perspective, there are opportunities from the perspective of the ability to review EU legislation, and we can give sort of specific examples of opportunities within that. But that's caveated by the reality that we recognise that the mechanisms proposed, and particularly the timescales proposed within this legislation, are not realistic, and we recognise the time and resource pressures that would put upon all those involved. And I think I just go back to our opening comments about the context that we find ourselves in. We as a trade association are under a lot of resource pressure, and our members are under a lot of pressure because of the past few years have been really difficult when you think about COVID, ongoing EU exit issues, and now what I'd term the cost of production crisis for our members and everybody throughout the supply chain. So industry is dealing with a lot at the moment, and added business uncertainty and increased resources required in this area wouldn't be welcomed. And as I've said previously, I think we want to look at a more sort of, I don't want to use the word ad hoc process, but review of EU retained legislation on an ongoing basis and try and prioritise what needs to be looked at first by industry and take that approach.